Hello guys, welcome back to my channel and enjoy this fanfic part 1. Now let's start the fanfic. Everything hurt. That was the extent of what Naruto's brain could currently comprehend. Anything else was easily shoved aside to make way for that blaring piece of information. Everything hurt. Naruto wanted to groan over how much pain his body was currently making him suffer through. It felt worse than when Sasuke had shoved the Chidori through his chest. He also wanted to curse, with Sasuke being the main subject of his anger as it was a natural reaction by now, but the long-ingrained lessons of shinobi survival refused to let him utter a sound or even twitch. Keeping his breathing even, he tried to focus on the smells and noise around him, trying to remember where he was and how the hell he had gotten there. The memories were slow to begin their return, coming in dribs and drabs as the mission he'd had with Sasuke came back to him. Flashback. They'd gone to Lightning Country to steal a scroll that some bandits had managed to get a hold of. It was meant to be routine, but unknown to their intelligence the bandits' leader was a missing rock nin and had caused them some trouble. They'd managed to kill off most of the bandits and had taken the scroll before beating a hasty retreat since they were outnumbered and also ill-prepared for a ninja of his caliber. They hadn't managed to get far back into Fire Country before the ninja and his friends caught up with them and a battle began. They'd managed to kill off most of them easily enough until only the rock nin and a few bleeding bandits were left. Naruto had been finishing off the last of the bandits when some innate sense had gone off and he'd glanced over to check on Sasuke. The rock ninja was holding him tightly, using a massive amount of his chakra to do it, as one of the bandits that Naruto hadn't realized was left standing held up a sword. It gleamed an unnatural green despite there being very little light to allow the effect. It was at that moment that Naruto could fully understand what Sasuke had said to him on the bridge when they were children. My body moved on its own. In 1 second Naruto was throwing a bandit to the side with a kunai lodged in his stomach. The next he was in front of Sasuke, a sword ripping through his chest and pain overtaking his senses. He saw the surprise register on the bandit's face as his body shut down, allowing him to view things somewhat mutely as he collapsed to his knees. The movement took the sword with him as it slipped uselessly out of the bandit's still stunned grasp. He could barely remember what happened after that as his mind started to slow with something more than pain and blood loss. What he knew logically wouldn't have been more than 5 minutes felt like hours before Sasuke was bent in front of him. Sasuke's face had been pure panic as he said things Naruto couldn't hear. Sasuke had ripped out the sword then but Naruto couldn't feel it as his eyes fell with Sasuke's to look at the weapon. A part of his mind, that sounded so much like a lecturing Sakura, translated what he saw into something he could understand. The blade was littered with symbols and was not only chakra but poison enhanced. He knew then that this wouldn't be particularly quick or easy death. Sasuke gently touched his cheek, making Naruto focus on him. His face was blank, but Sasuke's eyes were still fearful when he spoke again, but Naruto couldn't seem to hear him. He wanted to calm his usually stoic friend though, so he tried to smile but before he knew it, he had fallen forward into Sasuke's arms and unconsciousness. End flashback. Mulling over the information, Naruto could come to the somewhat comforting conclusion that at least he wasn't dead. His nose and ears were starting to catch up with his brain and he'd picked up the telltale signs of a hospital. The room he was in seemed to be quiet though, and he could only conclude he'd been out of it for a long time if he was moved to one of the lesser used wings. Not feeling particularly comforted by that thought, he decided to try to get his eyes to open so he could survey his surroundings and possibly find a way to get someone's attention. He hated hospitals, especially when he was as confused about his health, and what had happened, as he was. Forcing his eyelids to cooperate through sheer force of will, he managed to snap them open. He scrunched them closed a moment later as the bright lights burned his retinas, making him hold back a hiss. Ignoring this other part of his body that was joining the aches and pains, list. He blinked a few times until he could look around the room without flinching. The first thing he was able to confirm was that he was indeed in one of the lesser-used wards of the Konoha hospital. There were at least 5 other patients in the room with him, so he could only assume that while his injury was bad, it wasn't overly life-threatening and that he hadn't been out for too long, even if this reaction to an injury was a little unusual and worrying by his body's standards. Continuing to dart his eyes around, like he was attempting to move his neck at this point, he took a quick glance at himself, wondering if he could spot any obvious bandages or injuries, but his thoughts screeched to a stunned halt as he found, laying with their head just beside his left thigh, was a fast-asleep Sasuke Uchiha. Gaping slightly at the other man, Naruto completely ignored the fact that his jaw was aching from the small movement as he was too focused on the fact that Sasuke was sleeping by his bed. That Sasuke was keeping a somewhat vigilant seat at his bedside and that Sasuke was looking like he hadn't slept or showered properly in the last 48 hours. What the hell? Naruto allowed himself a few moments to just stare in bewilderment at his loosely acknowledged best friend while trying to think up a legitimate reason for the other to be sleeping by his feet. After almost 2 minutes of staring, and slight concern that Sasuke hadn't woken up at feeling eyes on him, he could only conclude that Sasuke had been taking a long string of missions while he'd been unconscious and on his, possibly forced, visit, he'd fallen asleep from exhaustion. It was the best Naruto could come up with, and with his worry for his own health starting to push more forcefully at the back of his mind, he finally allowed his contemplation of Sasuke to be shelved for the moment. Opening his mouth, he did his best to speak, his voice coming out a rough croak, "Sasuke." The reaction was instantaneous as Sasuke suddenly shot into a sitting position. His eyes and face became emotionless but for the guarded look to them. Naruto was almost relieved at seeing something so familiar, with his last memory of Sasuke being the terror-filled scene. His relief, however, was short-lived as Sasuke seemed to finally register he was the one to have spoken. His eyes widened slightly and Naruto swore he saw Sasuke's whole posture lose a large amount of tension. "Naruto," he practically whispered, eyes locked on the blondes as a million emotions seemed to pass through his eyes, making Naruto blink at him. His confusion and worry for Sasuke was beginning to double. He tried to express his concern without killing his parched throat. "What, happened?" Suddenly all the seemingly softness of Sasuke's features was gone and in its place came anger. Hot and scolding anger that was focused on Naruto in the form of one of his deadliest glares. Naruto would have flinched if he wasn't so sure his body would be racked with pain from it. "You idiot!" Sasuke all but snarled. "How dare you go in front of me and in the path of that sword? What the hell possessed you to do such a retarded thing like that? Do you have any idea how close you came to dying? I had to drag your sorry all the way back to Konoha where they barely had enough time to inject all the antidotes to the poisons littering that blade. They could barely keep you in a stable condition for the first 3 days." Naruto was staring wide-eyed by the time the Uchiha had finished his rant. He was standing up and leaning slightly over the hospital bed, looking all the more menacing as his Sharingan blazed fiercely in his eyes. Naruto could only look at him with shock as one thought went through his mind. I must have really scared him to make him swear that much. Sasuke only further proved Naruto's theory as he sunk back down into his chair, eyes fading back to their usual color as he looked at Naruto with the closest thing to helplessness Naruto was sure anyone would ever see. They were silent for a long moment, Naruto unsure what to say and Sasuke most likely brooding over everything he'd just blurted out. Suddenly he stood up, startling Naruto slightly. "I'm going to get a nurse," he said tersely. Sasuke hadn't taken more than 3 steps when Naruto spoke up, his voice still a rasp, "Sasuke." The other paused and tilted his head minutely to look at the blonde from the corner of his eye. Naruto wasn't even sure what he wanted to say, so he settled with an awkward and wholly inadequate solution. Did you give Tsunade the scroll? Sasuke's eyes flashed and his lips formed a thin, tight line. Yes. Without another word he was out of the room, leaving Naruto to stare at the door. He suddenly felt weary as he turned his gaze to the wall on the opposite side of the room. He kind of just wanted to go back into the land of unconsciousness. It was looking much less hassling than his life was about to become. Break. Naruto had actually been starting to doze despite the continued ache in his limbs, when the door banged open, making him flinch and screw up his eyes. His body trembling from pain as he sunk his teeth into his bottom lip. Why does everything hurt if I was stabbed through the chest? Brat. You awake? Tsunade's voice asked, cutting through the haze of mind-numbing pain. Ow, was all he managed to get out before grinding his teeth again. It felt like he was getting hit by multiple Senbon and Shuriken, from the inside out. He felt a hand on his forehead and he almost jerked back from the touch. Her hand was so cold. She sighed above him, and even though her words were brazen, he could hear the worry and sympathy under them. Worst is yet to come, brat. Your body's got about 6 different toxins in it and most of them will have lingering effects even after your body's flushed them out with fever. It'll probably take a month to fully recover, even with your healing. He opened his eyes into slits to stare at her. Tsunade's face was drawn into a tight frown. You're extremely lucky to be alive. Naruto did his best to summon up a smile as he answered, so I've heard. She seemed to relax slightly at his attempt and she let a glare slip on her face. Always have to make things difficult, don't you? Damn, kid. Grunting a reply while screwing up his face, he felt small shivers rack his frame, which only brought about a new wave of pain. God, he hoped she'd give him something to get rid of this. Hell, he'd take a punch to the head at this point. Anything to dull it would be fantastic right about now. Can't you give him anything to make him sleep? Naruto heard Sasuke ask with some amount of annoyance in his voice. He mentally praised and thanked the Uchiha for voicing the query. Tsunade's answer, however, made his heart sink. We don't know what will adversely affect his system, so for the time being, he'll just have to tough his way through it. Opening his eyes, Naruto glared at her as best he could. I hate you. She glanced at him, and a small smile twitched at her lips. Brat, but instead of saying more like he expected her to, she turned to Sasuke and said, You've been here every night anyway, so I hardly doubt you'll mind making it official. She looked between the two of them with equal intensity. Watch him. Sasuke barely got the time to give a curt nod before she was walking past him and disappearing back into the bowels of the hospital. Huh. Naruto thought while looking back at Sasuke. He's been here the whole time. Keeping his eyes on the other as Sasuke sat back down on the chair by Naruto's bed. Naruto waited for the last wave of pain to dull down enough that he could push the screaming of his body far, far away before speaking. Get me some water, bastard. His voice still sounded scratchy and it was also a lot weaker than usual. If Sasuke noticed, he didn't comment on it. Reaching over to the tray table, Sasuke grabbed a cup and held it to Naruto's lips, the usual barb slipping out from habit alone when some water started to roll down his chin. TCH. Idiot. Naruto held down his smile as he drank half of the small cup. When Sasuke removed it to place it back on the table, Naruto started debating whether or not to start a conversation or just try and go to sleep. Sitting back down in his seat, the Uchiha surprised him by speaking first, go to sleep. A spark of anger flared to life inside Naruto, and before he could stop it, the reply was slipping out, what if I don't want to? Sasuke looked at him with exasperation. Did you even hear what the Hokage said? You need all the damn rest you can get. And didn't that just bring to mind a question that overrode his need to argue with Sasuke? Hey, how long was out for? Something that Naruto couldn't identify passed across Sasuke's face and the Uchiha tensed visibly in his seat. It took him a few moments before he was able to relax himself and reply, I brought you back to Konoha 2 weeks ago, but there was an extra 2 days traveling where you wouldn't wake up. Naruto gaped slightly at Sasuke. Holy shit. That's just insane. What the hell was on that blade? Naruto paused, frowning. Hey, wait. If I was unconscious for that long, why the hell should I still need to sleep? To heal, dumbass, Sasuke snapped out. Naruto almost rolled his eyes, but managed to stop himself at the last second. He figured it would probably only make things worse. Well, I'm not tired. Just go to sleep. A small, indignant frown formed on Naruto's face. No, you can't make me. Naruto. His name so rarely used by Sasuke and said in such a harsh and almost strained voice made him pay instant attention. I don't want you getting worse. Eyes widening, Naruto looked at Sasuke with a healthy dose of shock swimming in his blue irises. Sasuke cared. Sasuke, Naruto murmured before trailing off, not even sure what he wanted to say to him. Just go to sleep, Naruto. Sasuke said tiredly, not looking at him as his posture faintly slumped. It took a few moments of consideration, but this time Naruto decided not to argue, and with one more puzzled glance at Sasuke, he let his eyes close. Despite the large list of injuries and even longer list of dangerous missions Naruto had been on throughout his career as a ninja, for the first time in his life, Naruto had spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and was showing no signs of being allowed home anytime soon. He'd begged, he'd threatened and he'd even tried bribing the medic Nins and Tsunade herself, but none of them would budge and he was left confined to the same bed he'd woken up in a week ago. So far 4 of the poisons had been flushed out of his system, but since he still had 2 more to go no one was willing to allow him to check out yet. It hadn't been too bad for the first few days as everyone had come to visit him. His friends had seemed to be evenly split down the middle. There were the people who just wanted to make sure he was okay and those who yelled at him for almost dying and scaring the crap out of them. He still wasn't sure which he preferred, but he'd have taken any of them today. No one but nurses he didn't know had come to see him since Sakura was busy in a separate ward and Tsunade was at the Hokage Tower. He was dying of boredom. The only thing he had to look forward to was the fact that, without fail, a few minutes after visiting hours ended, Sasuke would show up and spend almost the whole night by his bedside. At first he'd been surprised and a little suspicious, but Sasuke hadn't opened up anymore after that first night and their usual banter had continued, so he just let it slide. He figured Sasuke must have managed to discover a long-buried human emotion and was feeling guilty for the damage the sword had done. It worked for him if he got someone to talk to at night instead of killing himself just to end the dullness that was currently his life. He was just not made for long-term inactivity. What are you glaring at, idiot? Sasuke's voice made him start slightly and he growled under his breath at being caught off guard by the now smirking Uchiha. Don't sneak up on me. The other's smirk dropped as he looked at Naruto critically. You're still having trouble surveying a room. Naruto blushed lightly in both embarrassment and anger at himself. The total devastation to his system was cutting down a lot of the skills he would have once found simple. While he could walk on his own now for at least a few minutes before needing a rest, he still had trouble when it came to anything to do with his chakra or looking at someone else's. It was also one of the other main reasons he wanted to get the hell out of the hospital. He hated it when people kept coming in and asking him the same questions about his progress and telling him in sympathetic voices that it would just take time. He didn't want his failures continually shoved in his damn face. At least Sasuke just h'd after his answers on the rare times he asked. Fingers being snapped in his face brought him back to the present. Sasuke was standing over him and glaring slightly. Pay attention, dumbass. Shove it, bastard, Naruto growled while sitting up in the bed. He did his best to ignore the pain twinging through him and the way his chest constricted as he moved his back up against the pillows. His breathing was a bit labored by the time he was done, but Sasuke didn't comment on it as he changed the subject while moving to his now regular seat. When do you get out of here? Naruto groaned loudly. I don't know, damn it. And God, Sasuke, I am so bored I am ready to give up ramen for a year if it gets me out of here. His eyebrows rising delicately, Sasuke asked slowly, as if confirming he had heard right, you would give up ramen. If it gets me out of here, Naruto said determinedly. This statement was actually his secret weapon, used in the most dire of circumstances as it was only valid once per person because, in all honesty, he had kind of grown out of ramen. He'd eaten it so much as a kid that he just sort of couldn't get into it anymore. Iruka had warned him once or twice that it would happen, and really, when was his teacher ever wrong? It had been over the last year or so that he'd noticed his gradual disinterest in the food. He still ate it, just not as frequently or with as much vigor. It was why it was now such a good weapon. It looked like a desperate plea from him, but in actuality it was more like a medium-level appeal, and since Iruka was the only one who knew about his new feelings on the food, it would, hopefully, be the push needed to get Sasuke on his side and him out of the hospital. He just had to wait for the other's response. Sasuke was looking pensive as if he was trying to decide if he should say something or not. Naruto was really hoping that whatever it was, he would just tell him. His tolerance for silence was even lower than normal after the week in here, and he was anxious to tempt Sasuke over to his way of thinking and find a way to scheme him back home. When he noticed Sasuke's face clear, he instantly focused all his attention on the other ninja. Convincing Sasuke of anything usually took a lot of effort and a carefully planned trap by using the Uchiha's words against him. It might be possible for me to get you out of here, Sasuke spoke quietly, still looking like he was a few steps away from a good brood. Naruto perked up, a grin worming its way on his face despite the big, but he could feel looming ahead. Yeah. How? What do we have to do? For one of the few times in his life, Sasuke actually looked a little awkward. I was talking to Tsunade about your condition. You're still unable to live on your own, but if you were to live with someone else for a few months while you healed, as long as you maintained checkups as much as she saw fit, Tsunade would be willing to release you. Naruto felt like bouncing. That's it. That's all I have to do. Get someone to babysit me and lend me a couch. Eyes narrowing, Sasuke crossed his arms and leant back in the chair. No, it's not that simple. You would have to stay in someone's spare room as they stayed in the house with you 24 hours a day to make sure you didn't relapse. They would also have to have some kind of medical knowledge to keep you alive if anything happened or an antidote had to be administered. They would essentially be your nurse. Naruto felt his hopes drop throughout the other's reply as the reality of the request slowly sank in. There was no one who could do that for him. The only people who could potentially cover the medical aspect of the requirements were Sakura, Iruka and possibly Kakashi, and they were already busy with their own things. They also didn't have enough room in their homes to keep him there. He groaned and just barely resisted the urge to bury his face in his hands. Shit. There goes that chance. What the hell are you talking about? Sasuke snapped angrily. Lifting his head, Naruto frowned at the other's agitation. Sakura, Kakashi and Iruka would be too busy, and even if they weren't, their places are too small. Naruto trailed off as Sasuke's eyes narrowed dangerously, his posture stiffening as he growled out, and what about me? What about? Naruto cut himself off with wide eyes before he leant forward and asked in a mixture of disbelief and quickly developing hope, you would be my nurse. Sasuke's eye twitched at the word nurse, but he otherwise didn't react but to give a stiff nod. Naruto's grin could have lit up the room as he practically vibrated on the bed. If I could get out of this bed I would hug the shit out of you right now, Sasuke. Do that and I'll take back my damn offer, Sasuke muttered, his anger seeming to fade as he went back to his usual indifference. The reply however made Naruto pause, as a small frown formed. He knew this could be a potentially argument-fueling question, but he needed to ask. Hey Sasuke, not that I'm not really grateful and all, but why are you even offering? You don't even invite me over when I'm well. Naruto swore he could see the walls rise up around Sasuke as the doors and windows slammed shut. Hell, he was pretty sure he could even see the blinds fly into place. Do you want to stay in this bed for the next few weeks? Sasuke threatened. Holding up his hands in surrender, Naruto let out a little laugh and gave him a small grin. He was too happy to argue. Sasuke could have called him every name under the sun and told him he'd never make Hokage and he would have let it slip by right now. Why did he care what the reason was? He was getting out, and so what if Sasuke was the person behind it? He could allow Sasuke a few hours of being an emotionally handicapped and weird jerk. Fine, fine, stay secretive. Sasuke looked at him suspiciously for a few moments, but realizing Naruto wasn't going to pry, he also let it slide. I'll talk to the Hokage tomorrow. Naruto grinned brightly at Sasuke and he reached out with the arm that had 2 IV drips and a few bandages on it. Sadly, it was his better arm. He didn't care that he had to stretch more than usual to grasp Sasuke's shoulder. Thank you, Sasuke, he said sincerely. He couldn't be entirely sure, but for just a second, he could swear Sasuke's cheeks looked a little darker than usual. No problem, Naruto. Shaking it off, he sat back down on the bed. So, what's going on outside these disgustingly bland gray walls? Sasuke's lips twitched into a small smirk and Naruto started to relax as they began to converse. In the back of his mind though, he couldn't get the thought out of his head. No more hospital, yes. Break. It had taken 2 more days confined to the bed as Tsunade and Sakura fussed over him before they deemed him ready to be allowed under Sasuke's care. He'd been poked, prodded and all around experimented on while they each made lists and gave lectures to both of them on all the ways to keep him alive and well. By the time it was over, not only was Sasuke glaring at everything, but Naruto was managing to match the look almost perfectly too. Finally though, after what felt like forever, Naruto was sitting on the hospital bed, dressed in one of his black shirts and a pair of gray sweatpants. Sasuke had brought them over from the guest room he'd prepared by filling it with Naruto's things. Naruto was just waiting for Sasuke to show up and then he could be teleported to Sasuke's house. Tsunade had wanted to put him on a stretcher and carry him through town, but he'd adamantly refused, especially since the gleam in her eye had told him there was probably not much of a medical reason behind the suggestion. Sasuke was the one to eventually get her to let the idea go as he focused his glare on her and hinted that he'd tell Shizune where her secret bottle of sake was. Suffice to say the conversation had been dropped. Naruto didn't doubt Sasuke would pay for it later, but the Uchiha had seemed unconcerned and had merely left, promising to return in the morning to take him to his house. And that was what brought Naruto back to where he was. Pouting slightly, Naruto turned his head to look at Sakura as she sat at the end of his bed, scribbling something in a notebook. The years had really matured her in both body and mind. She no longer gushed over Sasuke or ignored Naruto. She had found a middle ground and had turned her attention away from boys to focus on her medical training under Tsunade. She now treated Sasuke and Naruto like the brothers she never had, and Naruto felt much the same, long having grown out of his crush on her. He did still play it up for fun, but Naruto was well aware that Sakura knew his affections were now platonic. Sakura, he began to whine, I'm bored. What am I supposed to do about it? She questioned, not stopping her movements or looking at him. Naruto grinned, not willing to miss the opportunity. Kiss me to make it better. She rolled her eyes, but he could see the grin twitching at her lips. Not if you were the last guy left in the world. Oh come on, Naruto tried. Are you really willing to condemn the entire human race to death just because you're still in denial about my good looks? She turned away from her page to give him an amused look. Her voice, however, was dry when she spoke. Any denials about you I may have aside, I hardly doubt we could repopulate the whole world. Naruto grinned. But does that mean you'd be willing to try? Sakura laughed lightly. Okay, Naruto, if we were the last two humans left and the two of us being together would somehow bring the population back, then sure, I'd try. I'm finally getting somewhere. Naruto cheered, making his friend giggle again. Now I just need to get you to agree in a few more plausible circumstances. Rolling her eyes, she replied, don't bet on it. Turning back to her notepad, she started writing again, even while calling out, and Sasuke, come inside from that windowsill, I'm sure Naruto is more than ready to leave. Naruto turned his head as fast as he could without hurting it to find that Sasuke was indeed sitting on the sill of the open window for the room. Naruto scowled lightly. I hate not being able to notice anything anymore. He felt Sakura reach out and pat his shoulder consolingly. At least you got rid of the last two toxins yesterday. Once your body works out the lingering effects, you should heal at your normal pace again. Your senses and chakra should also start to come back. I want to kill the person who made that sword. Naruto snapped out, not feeling comforted in the slightest. He felt someone stop in front of him and he looked up at Sasuke. His eyes met the others and his eyebrows rose a little at seeing the unspoken reply in their angry depths. So do I. Sasuke was the first to look away. Ready to go, idiot. Shaking his head to clear the lingering thoughts, Naruto let himself grin. Hell yeah, Sasuke bastard. Standing up on somewhat shaky legs, he turned to look at Sakura who was watching them closely. I'll see you during my checkup in a few days. She nodded and stood up with them. I'll be there. Sakura turned to look at Sasuke. Look after him. Sasuke gave a small grunt of acknowledgement and Naruto made sure they could both see him roll his eyes. Sakura tried to hide a smile while Sasuke sent him a light glare before reaching out to put a hand on his shoulder. Have you got everything? Well, since I came with nothing, I suppose I do. Sakura gave a short laugh before quickly covering her hand with her mouth to stifle it. Naruto sent her a curious look, and she slowly lowered it to reply with heavy sarcasm and amusement. Oh yeah, I can see you two living together without causing bloodshed. Glancing at Sasuke, Naruto scrutinized him for a second, before he just grinned and put his arm around the other's shoulders. His body protested loudly but he ignored it so he could get his point across to both of his friends. We're best friends, we'll be fine. He was staring at Sakura as he spoke, but he was still keeping a sharp eye on Sasuke, so when the other scowled and lightly ducked his head, Naruto caught it. He felt confused for what must have been the millionth time in the last week. What the hell is with Sasuke? We'll see, Sakura said, snapping him from his thoughts. She had a knowing look in her eyes as she looked between them before turning away. Naruto frowned, but just as he was turning back to look at Sasuke and question him, he saw leaves from the corner of his eye and felt the light dance of Sasuke's chakra ghost over him as Sasuke teleported them out of the hospital. His breath seemed to catch in his throat when they arrived, his whole body tensing as his vision swam. Oh shit, he thought as he felt his legs give way and his mind black out. This isn't a good thing. After that, everything went dark. Naruto woke up with a groan and a pounding headache. He brought a hand up to his head, only then realizing he was lying in a bed, one that was much more comfortable than both his own and the hospital's, he noted. What happened? You fainted, Sasuke stated from somewhere to his right. Opening his eyes, and internally cheering when nothing spun or was hard to focus on, he turned his head slightly to look at Sasuke. No shit. I want to know why I fainted. Be more specific, then, idiot. Naruto let out a slight growl at the response. Sasuke just rolled his eyes before continuing impassively. Your body wasn't prepared for the sudden shift in location or for the strong amount of chakra to your system, so you collapsed. Naruto frowned. But Tsunade and Sakura have used their chakra on me, right? Why didn't theirs have a bad effect too? Sasuke's look was one of slight irritation as he responded, medical ninjas have a much higher level of chakra control. They would have been using less invasive ones so you wouldn't react negatively. Medical jutsu and teleportation jutsu are in entirely different categories. He paused and gave Naruto a condescending look. Don't you pay attention to anything? Turning away from Sasuke and sitting himself up, he used his examination of the room as an excuse to not continue the conversation. The walls were a dark blue, and the furnishings were bland and uninteresting. A wooden desk, cupboards and a built-in wardrobe. There was also the blue upon blue linen that covered the double bed he was in. He noticed a door to the bathroom behind Sasuke and Naruto was sure it would be just as boring and blue as his new bedroom. Is this where I'll be staying? He asked while scanning the room again, cataloging all the places he could add things to give the room some damn color and life. Yes, this is one of the guest rooms. It's 2 doors down from the room I'll be occupying. His response made Naruto turn to the other with his nose scrunched up. Occupying. Can't you speak like a normal person and just say it's your bedroom? Sasuke's eyes narrowed. My bedroom is on the 2nd floor. It will be easier for you to be on the 1st floor, and since I need to be close to you in case something happens, I moved myself to one of the other spare rooms. It was just for a second, but Naruto felt the overwhelming urge to apologize and then maybe hug Sasuke tightly in gratitude for all he was doing. Naruto knew that Sasuke was an extremely private person, and that he hated accommodating others. He did things his own way. Yet for some reason that Naruto still wasn't sure of, he was doing all this for him. Naruto knew he'd probably end up paying for the gesture later, but for the time being, he could at least pretend Sasuke was doing it from the goodness of his heart. So, plastering on a teasing smile, he said, "Damn, Sasuke. How many rooms does this place have?" Crossing his arms, Sasuke just let out a HN in response, making Naruto roll his eyes before glancing around the room again. So bastard, where's my stuff? Your clothes are in the cupboards and in the wardrobe. He paused for a moment, and Naruto turned to look at him curiously. Sasuke looked decidedly uncomfortable. That hat thing of yours is under the pillow. Naruto brightened and turned, burying his hand under it to pull out his old, childhood sleeping cap. It was a little frayed here and there and had been stitched up a few times, but he still wore it to bed every night he was in the village. Placing it beside him on the mattress, he flashed Sasuke a smile. Did you bring anything else of mine? Sasuke shook his head. No. You shouldn't need anything else for the first few days you're here. If you require something more, it won't be hard for me to retrieve it. Alright then, Naruto agreed amiably, but even as he said it, he was already planning on getting Sakura to grab him a few things so he could decorate his room when Sasuke was otherwise occupied. So what are we going to do? Sasuke looked at him blankly. What? I'm bored. You're here to look after me, so entertain me. Fat chance, Sasuke stated. Naruto fixed a pout on him. Come on, Sasuke. This is our first night together, you've got to show me a good time. If Naruto didn't know better, he would swear Sasuke was blushing, and maybe even a little flustered. His voice, however, was the same emotionless tone, so Naruto figured he was probably just imagining things. No. Why not? It's not that hard. Hell, I'll settle for a TV, and some movies. Sasuke crossed his arms. The only TV in the house is in my room. Well, plug it in here. Naruto said happily. Once again, Sasuke looked uncomfortable, and it took him a few moments under Naruto's expectant stare before he admitted stiffly, I don't watch much TV. Naruto blinked. What does that have to? He cut himself off before grinning gleefully. You don't know how to set it up, do you? Sasuke glared. I was never one to sit down and spend hours wasting away in front of an idiot box. Rolling his eyes, Naruto ignored the thinly veiled insult towards his intelligence. Whatever. Just get it in here and I'll show you. Naruto was almost vibrating with enthusiasm by the time he finished. Then you can get some movies from my place and we'll have a marathon with dinner. Sasuke still didn't look particularly pleased with the idea, but he stood up nonetheless. I'm picking the movies. Well duh, Naruto replied, you're the one going to my apartment. Dumbass, Sasuke muttered, and on instinct Naruto threw back his customary, bastard, as Sasuke made his way out of the room. When Sasuke was out of sight, Naruto leant back against the pillows with a smile. What was Sakura worried about? Living with Sasuke was going to be a piece of cake. Break. For Sasuke, I said the yellow hole, not the blue one. I know you're partial to the damn color, but an electrical shock is really not worth fulfilling this obsession. Spinning around to snarl at Naruto, Sasuke held up the wire in his hand while growling out, you never said this plug went in the yellow one. You said it was in the one next to the red hole. How the hell am I supposed to know which one you mean when your instructions? Naruto glared. My instructions are fine. If you could actually see and distinguish one color from another, we wouldn't be having this problem. I'm praised for my eyesight, dumbass, Sasuke snapped. You're the one with the half-assed directions who's known for his idiocy. Frustrated, Naruto picked up the remote and hurled it at Sasuke, only getting angrier at his muscles' inadequacy as it landed on the floor somewhere between them. Sasuke raised an eyebrow and smirked scornfully. Naruto crossed his arms and turned away from the Uchiha slightly. If I'm so useless at helping you, then why don't you just use your Sharingan to memorize the manual, huh? I don't have a manual. Sasuke's voice sounded strained, like he was trying to keep a grip on his anger and not come over and throttle Naruto. Naruto let out a large huff of air before turning back to face Sasuke. He was still standing in front of the TV, but now he was glaring at it while he absently twirled the cord between his fingers. Okay, Naruto said, summoning up whatever vestige of calm still remained inside him, let's try this again. Sasuke looked at him with slightly raised eyebrows, but Naruto ignored his disbelief. If we put the yellow plug in the wrong hole, we just have to find the right one. The smallest scowl began to form on Sasuke's face, and Naruto almost groaned. He was just waiting for the rebuttal saying that he got it wrong, not Sasuke, or even how it was obvious that's what they had to do. The superiority complex that was Sasuke just had to correct him. Fine. Naruto straightened in his seat, blinking at Sasuke's back in incredulity as he started fiddling behind the TV once again. Wait, Naruto said, making Sasuke look behind his shoulder at him, you're just going to agree. Contrary to popular belief, Naruto, Sasuke answered, I don't enjoy fighting with you every 5 seconds over pointless things. If you're actually going to use some of the small amount of intelligence and restraint that you possess, then I'm not going to challenge it. Naruto was silent for a few moments. I'm not sure whether that was an insult or a compliment. Sasuke groaned, his shoulders slumping over the TV slightly. I take it back, you're still a complete idiot. Hey! Naruto protested, I'm not the one who doesn't know how to install a TV. Whatever. Sasuke muttered, we're almost done anyway. Frowning slightly, Naruto had to silently concede the point when the TV suddenly came to life, and a news program began airing. Moving away, Sasuke picked up the remote from the floor and causally tossed it to land beside Naruto. Shoving his left hand in his pocket, Sasuke headed for the door. You hungry? Naruto's stomach rumbled loudly at the question, and Naruto gave Sasuke a slightly sheepish smile. Yeah, how about you get some food and pick up the movies from my place, and then we'll eat up here. Sasuke paused before his eyes flicked to the bed and the TV before landing on Naruto. There was something on his face that it had Naruto's stomach knotting nervously, and he didn't know why. When Sasuke turned around and away from him, Naruto almost wanted to call him back so he could try and distinguish whatever that look had meant. He didn't, though, and Sasuke just continued out the door, throwing his agreement over his shoulder. Whatever. Naruto frowned a little once the other disappeared. What the hell was up with Sasuke lately? He'd been weird ever since Naruto had woken up. It was starting to annoy him, especially when he had no damn clue what was causing it. He was going to go insane if he spent a month with a confusing Sasuke on top of a bastard Sasuke without knowing why the first one was anywhere near the second. Wait. Naruto paused as he rethought his previous sentence and blushed lightly. Two Sasukes on top of each other. Oh great, now Sasuke's weirdness was starting to rub off on him. Damn it, he muttered, pressing his right hand to his forehead as another innuendo passed through his mind. He blamed Jiraiya for the corruption of his once innocent thoughts. He was normal before he started training with that pervert. But no, all of that aside, definitely forcing all of that aside, it didn't change the fact that Sasuke was still acting strangely. Determination started to surge through and practically radiate off Naruto as he sat up straighter and declared, if I'm going to be stuck with that bastard, I'm going to find out what's wrong with him and figure out a way to fix it. He paused, an amused smile starting to form as he added his childhood catchphrase for the first time in years, believe it. During Sasuke's absence from the room, Naruto had spent the first 5 minutes taking a more detailed look around his new bedroom. He didn't come up with many new discoveries other than the fact that the ceiling was as blue and as clean as the rest of the room. Naruto figured he'd have to wait until he was a bit stronger to do some proper examining. He'd turned to the TV at that point, flicking through the few channels Sasuke had in the hopes of finding something interesting to watch. Naruto hadn't been sure whether to laugh at the predictability of it, or cry at the unfairness that Sasuke only seemed to have educational, weather and news stations. There wasn't a single thing he could watch without falling asleep. In the end, he just turned off the TV, and after glancing at the clock, only 10 minutes wasted so far, he started shuffling towards the edge of the bed. Since he had nothing to do and couldn't very well formulate a plan to figure Sasuke out without more conclusive evidence, he decided, weak muscles or not, that he was going to explore this room. Reaching the edge, he sat up before pushing the covers off him, wondering briefly just why Sasuke had decided to put him in the bed. He'd only fainted, for God's sake. Turning so he could place his feet on the floor, he shivered slightly at the cold temperature. His apartment floor was never this chilly during this time of the year. Did Sasuke's house absorb his personality? Dismissing the thought for the moment, Naruto focused his attention on reaching out and placing his palm on the bedside table, using it to lever himself carefully into a standing position. When his head didn't spin, he grinned before slowly starting to head towards the first set of drawers. He didn't want to overexert himself, which, okay, he might have done that already, if passing out was any indication, but he was bored. Just because he'd fainted once didn't mean he'd do it again. After all, that was from a jutsu's interference in the first place. A short walk shouldn't pose too much of a problem. Continuing his mental encouragement, it wasn't until he reached the dresser that he let himself beam, his breathing a bit labored despite only having walked a few meters. See, he said lightly, I'm getting better every day. You're becoming more stupid every day, Sasuke hissed, and Naruto winced slightly at the poison dripping from his words. Turning around cautiously, Naruto kept one hand on the dresser as he asked with a disarming smile, Hey, Sasuke. Back so soon? When he met the other's gaze, Naruto's smile dropped slightly. Sasuke looked less than pleased by his little exploration. The hand that was holding the bags of takeout dinner and videos was clenched so tightly that Naruto was surprised he wasn't ripping the material. Why are you out of bed? Sasuke demanded, each word coming out sharp and clear. Naruto's smile turned a little sheepish and the hand not holding the dresser came to scratch behind his head. Ah, I was bored. You had the TV. There's nothing on. Naruto tried, watching as Sasuke twitched from clenching his jaw so tightly. Naruto tried to implement damage control. At least I didn't faint. Walking forward, Sasuke put the food and videos beside the bed, continuing without pause until he was right in front of Naruto. And what if you had? Do you not understand how fragile your body still is? Naruto let out an agitated huff of air. I'm a ninja and the vessel to the Kyuubi. I think my body's got a damn good leap in front of everyone when it comes to a bill of health. Not right now it doesn't, Sasuke growled before reaching out and prying Naruto's hand from the dresser and bringing the other arm around his shoulders. We're putting you back in that bed. I do not plan on cleaning up the mess if you fall over and kill yourself in my house. Naruto rolled his eyes but allowed Sasuke to lead him back. You're such a mother hen, Sasuke. The only reply Sasuke gave was a non-committal grunt that made Naruto want to hit the Uchiha over the back of the head. He managed to restrain himself though, he knew better than to hit the person who was helping him walk. When they reached the bed, Sasuke set him down before returning to the bags he'd abandoned. Shifting into a more comfortable sitting position, Naruto asked, "What did you bring, bastard?" Sasuke shot him a glare, but Naruto ignored the look, his stomach already rumbling as Sasuke pulled out their dinner. It looked like chicken on rice with some kind of sauce and a mixture of vegetables. Naruto's mouth was already starting to salivate and he held out his hands with a grin. Handing over the food, Sasuke also gave him a tea towel with a pointed look, and not wanting to start an argument, Naruto placed it over his lap. Pulling apart his chopsticks, Naruto opened the container's lid and dug in. His eyes closed briefly at the taste, it was so good. He wasn't sure if it was the weeks of hospital food talking or just an amazing chef, but he didn't think he'd ever had anything so delicious in his life. Moving to take another bite, he had just popped it in his mouth when his attention shifted to the TV that had been turned on and a movie put in. Turning to Sasuke, he was about to ask what movie it was when he noticed something that made him frown and hurriedly swallow his food. Hey bastard, what the hell are you doing on that chair? Sasuke turned to him with a raised eyebrow, the rest of his face blank as he held his chopsticks in one hand as the other rested over the container of his unopened dinner. You eat so fast that I might as well just wait in the room until you finish your meal. I can take the trash out all at once that way. Huh. Naruto blinked. No, you idiot, why are you not on the bed? Sasuke's other eyebrow shot up to meet the first one, but Naruto wasn't wasting any more time as he put the lid back on his food before setting it beside him. He then leant over the bed so he could grab the sleeve of Sasuke's shirt and pull him forward. He figured he must have really surprised Sasuke, because that was the only reason he could imagine for Sasuke to let Naruto yank him into an ungraceful heap on the bed beside the blonde, especially with Naruto so weakened in the first place. When Sasuke didn't complain and just righted himself with a small frown, Naruto took back his food and pressed play on the remote, starting the movie, which was actually one of his favorites. Glancing briefly at Sasuke, he used the clean end of his chopsticks to poke Sasuke's shoulder. Get the lights. You can't enjoy a good movie without darkness. What is this, Naruto's movie etiquette 101? Despite the complaint, he still got up and made his way over to the light switch. Instead of answering, Naruto just pulled the lid off Sasuke's dinner and stole a piece of chicken in retribution. It wasn't as good as his, but Naruto still planned to steal a few more bites before the night was out. Feeling the bed dip and Sasuke sit beside him, Naruto couldn't help but grin as he stole another piece. Sasuke shot him a disapproving look, but Naruto just winked at him, mischief swimming in his eyes. The movie started moments later, and even when Naruto focused his attention on it, he still saw Sasuke steal some of his own dinner in return. Naruto knew Sasuke could have done it without him noticing, but that wasn't what this was about. Granted, Naruto didn't know what it was about, but he did know this wasn't their usual rivalry or even their usual bickering. If anything, this was their friendship. The thought made Naruto smile, and from the corner of his eye, Naruto could swear he saw Sasuke smiling too. Break. It only took them an hour before they had finished eating, and stealing each other's food. When they were done, Naruto paused the movie and grinned at Sasuke. Any chance you got is some dessert? I don't like sweet things, Sasuke replied, but before Naruto could complain, Sasuke pulled out a small container Naruto hadn't noticed earlier and handed it to the blonde. Opening it curiously, Naruto let out a small, excited sound and took the spoon Sasuke was still holding so he could eat the green tea ice cream Sasuke had bought him. He let out a small appreciative moan when he tried some. That is so good. He knew this wasn't the hospital talking. This simply was the best green tea ice cream he had ever had. Licking the spoon to get off every drop, he turned to Sasuke. Where did you get? He cut himself off, frowning at Sasuke when he wouldn't look at the blonde's face and once again seemed uncomfortable. You okay? Sasuke gave a small grunt of acknowledgement and started to climb off the bed. Reaching out instantly, Naruto managed to snag Sasuke's shirt for the second time that night. Hey, wait. Sasuke, what's wrong? Nothing, Sasuke answered neutrally. I'm going to go to my room so you can finish your movie. I'll get the rest of your rubbish later. He started to pull away, but Naruto only held on tighter, not that he thought it would do much good anyway. What are you talking about? Don't you like the movie? You picked it, you know. Sasuke finally turned his head to face him. He looked somewhat confused, although his voice was still a monotone when he replied. We don't do well in each other's company. If we want to survive this, then I suggest we keep our interaction on a strictly necessary basis. What the hell? Naruto stared at Sasuke for a long moment as his mind went a couple hundred miles an hour. What was Sasuke talking about? It sounded like he didn't want to spend time with him. But how could that be right? Hadn't they been having fun just then? Hell, Sasuke had offered his home and spent almost every night at the hospital with him. Did Sasuke think Naruto didn't want to spend time with him? Well, Naruto would have to put a stop to that stupid idea. I asked you to sit up here and watch a movie with me. That tends to mean I want your company. So why are you bailing? And why did you offer your house if you didn't want to spend time with me, too? There came that strange look again, and for a moment, Naruto panicked that he'd interpreted Sasuke's response wrong, or that he was about to learn about his stay had the biggest catch in the world attached to it. Sasuke's next words halted his worrying though, even if it did bring back that almost ever-present confusion. You want me to stay here? Shoving away that extra amount of confusion Sasuke's response brought. For now, he answered with some small amount of annoyance. And really, why did Sasuke always have to overcomplicate the simplest things? Yes, you idiot, so sit down, stop being a jerk and maybe then I won't hit you for making me let my ice cream melt. Dumbass, Sasuke quietly said, but he still looked slightly puzzled. And hey, Naruto could relate. Glancing at him from the corner of his eye, Naruto took another spoonful of ice cream, pondering the slight softness he had heard in Sasuke's tone. All of a sudden, it hit him and he almost dropped his spoon. He couldn't believe he'd missed it when the same thing could be said about him. Sasuke's lonely. He wanted someone in the house to talk to and spend time with. He probably didn't want to admit it, emotionally stunted prick that he was, so he used Naruto's injury as a way to go about getting company. Naruto didn't doubt he was also getting off on being able to boss Naruto around, but it was mostly about interaction. This mansion seemed suffocating in its silence. Looking Sasuke up and down, he nodded, pleased with his analysis. Lightly nudging Sasuke's shoulder, he grinned at him. You should invite me over here more when I get better. Sasuke gave him a skeptical look. Say that again once a week's passed. I will. Naruto told him firmly. Sasuke just shook his head lightly. Just put the movie back on. Can't. Naruto replied absently, starting to feel his bladder complain. Scooping up the last of his ice cream and letting out another, longer moan as he swallowed it, he opened his eyes only to feel his good mood shift as he frowned. Sasuke had that look about him again. What the hell had he done to receive it? Maybe having company around was only a small part of Sasuke's problem. It seemed that there was a lot more inspiring his strangeness than just loneliness. It was such bad timing too, he couldn't sit here and try to figure it out when he really had to go to the bathroom. He'd just have to ask Sasuke for his help and hope for the best. Maybe he could figure it out as they walked across the room and he pried him for information. In a subtle way, of course. Sasuke. He waited until he received a grunt of acknowledgement, because Sasuke wasn't looking at him anymore. It was all beginning to piss him off, and he ended up snapping his request. Help me get off here and take me into the bathroom. 1. He felt some confusion override his anger when Sasuke whipped his head up to look at him with that guarded face again, although there was visible surprise in it this time. Naruto once again wasn't sure what he'd done to accomplish more of this weirdness, and was that another blush too, but he made a mental note to ask Tsunade to examine Sasuke's head after she checked him out, just in case. Standing up, Sasuke moved around to the right side of the bed and pulled Naruto's arm around his shoulders. Pushing himself out of the bed, Naruto helped Sasuke as much as he could as they made their way through the darkened room. Naruto absently wondered if Sasuke was using his Sharingan to direct them, but dismissed the thought to focus more on Sasuke's behavior. With their backs to the TV, it was too dark for Naruto to read Sasuke's face, and he internally frowned in annoyance. Without a visual reaction to go by, any questions he did ask would be useless. He'd have to postpone the investigation until they were back on the bed. I can leave you in the bathroom without you cracking your skull open. Sasuke questioned. Naruto almost rolled his eyes as Sasuke opened the door. Yeah. I'll call you when I need your help again. Sasuke gave a grunt in reply before switching on the light. Naruto blinked for a moment to let his eyes adjust. Once they had and he could see the room, he did let them roll this time. What do you know? He said sarcastically, more blue. Just hurry up. Sasuke snapped in response, moving him over to the basin and walking away when Naruto had a firm grip on it. I'll be throwing out the garbage. Naruto waved him off as he glanced around the bathroom. There was a porcelain toilet, not far from the vanity basin he was in front of, which had built-in cupboards that opened up underneath it, and while the basin was both white and porcelain like the toilet, the vanity itself seemed to be made of something like marble. A mirror spanned the area of the wall above it. A large shower with a white curtain was on the opposite side of the room, and a rack for towels was to the right of the door. The floor was also tiled with the occasional blue flower pattern disrupting their polished and white color. Naruto also didn't miss the Uchiha fan that was present on the tiles that contained flowers. Wow! Naruto muttered once the door had closed, what an overdone and boring bathroom. Making his way over to the toilet, he made sure to add this room to his things to fix list. Break. Sasuke ended up being gone for almost 10 minutes, and during that time, Naruto took the opportunity to explore as best he could. He got tired easily from too much moving around, so he settled on pulling out bathroom supplies from inside the cupboard under the sink. They were all new and the same brands that he used. Sasuke must have looked through his apartment too, and he couldn't quite stop himself from snorting at the orange toothbrush Sasuke had supplied for him. He had just managed to finish brushing his teeth and was wiping his hands on the hand towel, everything now stowed back inside, when he heard a knock on the door. Turning to it, he called out, "Come in." There was a pause before the door opened and Sasuke entered. His face was back to its usual blank mask as he walked over to Naruto, scanning the room as he did. Naruto couldn't help wondering if Sasuke had used his Sharingan to memorize his house, just so he could know what Naruto had touched. He probably would have if he wasn't so pedantic about chakra wastage, Naruto thought absently. Ready? Sasuke asked, breaking Naruto from his thoughts. Naruto almost rolled his eyes. Yeah. Wrapping his arm around Sasuke's shoulders, he let himself be led out of the bathroom. He would never have admitted it out loud, but his legs were killing him. It took all he had to stop them from wobbling. He was really looking forward to that bed. Sasuke turned off the light, kicking the bathroom door shut behind them, and Naruto had to blink slightly to refocus, the only light in the room now coming from the TV. Despite his inability to see very well, they managed to make it to the bed without any stumbles or collisions, and Naruto happily climbed under the covers. Reaching out for the remote, he had to pat the bed a few times before he could find it, but once he'd grasped it, he turned to Sasuke. He was still standing beside the bed, but in a place that conveniently hid his face in the shadows. Bastard. Come on. Get your butt in here. It may have been dark, but Naruto could still visualize the look on Sasuke's face at his comment. One eyebrow raised and the faintest flecks of disbelief in his eyes. Then again, his mind whispered traitorously, "You could be wrong. You hardly know how he'll react to what you say or do anymore." And Naruto was just going to ignore that for now. Sasuke at least made it slightly easier by replying to him. "What?" He sounded faintly incredulous as he stayed rooted to the spot. Grabbing the covers, he lifted them slightly in invitation as he explained, "You're always the first one to freeze on missions, which I always find hilarious since you're such an ice prince, but it also means that you bitch at me for laughing or never getting affected by the cold. So I'm going to save myself a lot of grief by making sure you stay warm." Shaking the covers slightly, Naruto added, "Now get in. I want to finish watching the movie." Sasuke stayed stubbornly where he was. "I'm not going to. I'll tell everyone you're a shit caretaker." Naruto could practically feel Sasuke's eyes narrow, but he still didn't move. "I'll tell everyone your room is pink." When he once again didn't react, Naruto pulled out the big guns. "I'll tell your fangirls where your room is and how to." He cut himself off as Sasuke shoved his hand out of the way and got inside, glaring the whole time. "I hate you." Naruto just grinned cheerfully while turning back to the TV, not even bothering to reply as he pressed play. He faltered slightly when the next scene began. This was always his least favorite scene. It was mostly dialogue between the hero and heroine as they so obviously danced around their feelings. It was so stupid. Wanting to express some of his agitation, he glanced at Sasuke. He was watching the movie with interest, and since Naruto couldn't tell if it was feigned or not, he leaned close to Sasuke to whisper his words into the other's ear. "You'd think people would get a clue and admit their damn feelings, you know." He felt Sasuke go rigid beside him and Naruto could swear the other stopped breathing. His words were strained when he spoke. "What? In the movie," he said slowly, slightly concerned for Sasuke's mental health, "they take forever to say how they feel." Naruto was watching Sasuke carefully, so when the tension in Sasuke's muscles started to release, he was able to tell that Sasuke was deliberately doing it slowly, as if he didn't want Naruto to notice. "It's to build suspense, surely even you can understand that," Sasuke replied, his voice a monotone, and Naruto was pretty sure he was trying to deflect attention from his real reaction by egging Naruto into an argument. Naruto let out a disbelieving huff that had nothing to do with Sasuke's theory on the movie's plot line. Naruto was about to try prying the reason behind Sasuke's tension out of him when the raven let out a sudden shiver. Naruto was once again thrown through a loop. There was no way Sasuke was cold. Naruto knew this for a fact, because even when Sasuke was covered in icicles he barely shivered, his pride stopped him. So what had made him shiver? Had Naruto's breath tickled him? Or was this one more part of that strangeness Sasuke continued to exude? Maybe he was so rigid because Naruto was close to him. Naruto already knew Sasuke had some personal space issues, so was this another part of it? Maybe being lonely for so long had made him averse to touch when it wasn't in a fighting scenario. Maybe he was even trying to break that by inviting Naruto to stay here. It kind of made sense in the "I'll never tell you the true reason I do things" way of Sasuke's. Well, if it was the truth, Naruto had no problem assisting him with that. He was always happy to help out, especially when Sasuke was already doing so much for him, even if there was a selfish motive behind it. He'd just have to take it slow, not only to keep Sasuke from realizing he'd figured it out, but because Naruto had a feeling if he pushed too hard Sasuke would run even further from healthy human relationships. Grinning internally, Naruto let out a yawn that started out fake but soon became real. Damn, he was kind of tired, as he leant his head against Sasuke's shoulder. He felt Sasuke tense again. "What are you doing?" he growled out, but since he didn't shove Naruto off, the blonde was encouraged. "I'm tired." "Then lie on a pillow," Sasuke snapped. Naruto couldn't help grinning a little at that. "Nah. It's easier to talk this way." His smile turned a little devious since he knew it was hidden from Sasuke's view. "Besides, you shivered a few seconds ago, right? This way I'll keep you warm." There was a long silence and Naruto could practically hear Sasuke cursing in his head and trying to find a way out of it. He even started to shift away, and for a moment Naruto hesitated, but then he forcibly shoved the deliberation aside. He was going to help Sasuke, and like usual, that meant beating him around the head and shoulders until he gave in. Reaching out with his left arm, he lightly gripped the edge of Sasuke's shirt. "We've shared a bed before. We were on a mission," Sasuke answered, but Naruto could already feel him wavering, and he was thankful for it, because he was suddenly getting really tired. His body seemed to be realizing how worn out it was now that he was relaxing. It also helped that Sasuke was surprisingly comfortable. He smelled nice too. "Well, consider this a mission," Naruto mumbled, his eyes drifting shut. "You are looking after me and all." He yawned again, his voice fading fast. "Tsunade's orders, right?" He heard Sasuke sigh slightly as he began to drift off, Sasuke's arm moving to wrap around and support his lower back. It was just as he fell asleep moments later that the Uchiha softly whispered his response. "I offered." When Naruto woke up the next morning, his face instantly formed into a confused frown. There was no way he was laying on a pillow. He opened his eyes, careful to keep his breathing even and his body still. He focused on what he was leaning against. Relief quickly rushed over him as he noticed a familiar blue shirt, remembering the previous night and determining that he was currently wrapped around Sasuke. Stifling a yawn so he wouldn't wake the other, Naruto blinked away his sleepiness and slowly lifted his head so he could look up at the Uchiha. Sasuke was resting peacefully. His hair was framing his pale face that had an almost happy expression on it. Naruto found himself staring. He'd seen Sasuke sleeping before, but it was always with a small scowl or stiffness to his limbs that gave the impression he was ready to spring into action at the smallest disturbance. Naruto had long since given up on figuring out why Sasuke always frowned, but he had put some considerable time into trying to understand his inability to sleep normally. Naruto could accept his tense posture on missions, when you couldn't let your guard down even when resting, but one of the few times Sasuke had crashed at his house, Too tired to trek to his own home. He had been rigid then, too. So why, he thought with disbelief, is he relaxed now? Did he really crave human contact so much that one night in the same bed went this far? Or, that same annoying and traitorous part of his mind whispered again, maybe it's just because it was one night with you. Naruto blanched. Yeah, right, like I could do anything to protect either of us right now, he frowned. Or maybe it's because I am defenseless. That makes it easier for him, there's no threat. Although something about that idea didn't feel quite right, it made enough sense that Naruto was willing to go with it, even if it implied that Sasuke didn't trust him unless he couldn't fight. But then, why let him stay in his house? God, Sasuke was more confusing than any jutsu could ever be. Still scowling, Naruto leant forward slightly, studying Sasuke's face. Why was he so unreadable all the damn time? And hell, why was his skin so perfect? He'd never noticed it before, but seriously, he was inches away and it was flawless. How did he keep himself so? Naruto's thoughts trailed off, his eyes widening slightly when Sasuke's eyelids flicked open. Shit. That was the only thing that passed through his mind before. In one movement, he found himself on his back with the wind knocked out of him as Sasuke leant over him, one hand on his chest and the other raised as if to punch him. They both blinked in surprise before Sasuke quickly jumped away as if burned, pushing himself up against the headboard of the bed. Naruto slowly untangled himself from the sheet and sat up as well. Sasuke refused to meet his eyes and Naruto took the moment to press a hand to his chest. Although Sasuke hadn't put too much pressure on him, he was still recovering from his wounds, and that meant the flip had done enough to not only strain his muscles, but to make his chest ache where the wound from the sword had once been. It was also a little harder to breathe, too. How badly are you hurt? Sasuke asked, a rough edge to his voice, and Naruto couldn't decide whether it was because he had just woken up or because of some kind of emotion. He personally hoped Sasuke was just half awake. Everything just got stretched and shocked, I think. Naruto cautiously spread out his arms before moving the rest of his body. When nothing protested too much, his grin became a tad mischievous. As long as you don't throw me on the bed and straddle me again, I'll live. The comment was meant to be made in jest, but Sasuke didn't seem to take it that way. His face closed off before he looked away, his muscles tense and his face hidden behind his bangs. Naruto's eyes narrowed. If Sasuke was feeling guilty, he was going to get hit. Sure, Sasuke probably should have been more alert and not attacked him like that, but Naruto would have done the same thing if he'd been shocked awake by someone leaning over him in bed. Then again, Sasuke could just be tapping into that well of weirdness and be freaking out over sharing a bed with someone and relaxing around them. Regardless of the fact that he was the one who had suggested living together in the first place. This really was going to be harder than he had first thought. He even had to placate the guy now. His life was ridiculous. Don't worry about it, Sasuke, Naruto told him as seriously as he could, even when he was internally grumbling some unpleasant things about his friend. I know you're not used to having people you can trust close to you. Sasuke didn't show any sign of even hearing him, but before Naruto could say anything more, Sasuke was climbing out of the bed. This is an incident we won't repeat, Naruto. I'm sure you can watch movies without my company from now on. Naruto stared at Sasuke for a long moment. He wasn't entirely sure how he could phrase all the incredulity and agitation he felt into one statement. He wasn't even sure that if he came up with the perfect reply to what Sasuke had said that he would be able to work his throat into getting it out without punching Sasuke to a pulp at the same time. What part of what he just said could Sasuke have possibly interpreted to make him think Naruto hadn't liked sleeping with him? Wait. Naruto winced. That came out wrong. Shaking his head slightly to clear it, he placed his attention back on the Uchiha. Maybe if he got him talking, Naruto could find a way to agitate him enough that he'd admit what his problem was. It had worked for him in the past. What are you talking about, bastard? Forget it. Sasuke said quickly, a little too quickly, in Naruto's opinion. I'll go make breakfast. Sasuke started to turn and leave the room, and Naruto knew he had to do something fast if he wanted to keep this conversation going and keep Sasuke from crawling back into his emotionless shell. Wait. Naruto called out, his mind going a mile a minute. How long will breakfast be? I'll need to shower first, and I can't get there by myself. Naruto internally congratulated himself. Let's see Sasuke get out of that one. The Uchiha would have to help him to the shower, and in doing so he'd have a chance to convince Sasuke that getting close to him wasn't a bad thing. They didn't have to share a bed again, even if Sasuke was kind of really comfortable. That was what girls were for anyway. Breakfast will be in about 20 minutes, Sasuke replied, and Naruto started to grin. Score 1-4. Naruto's internal triumph was cut short as Sasuke's hands moved at a speed he couldn't quite detect before a shadow clone was standing beside him. He'll help you into the shower and downstairs. Without waiting for a response, Sasuke walked out of the room and left his shadow clone standing a few meters away. It had the same superior stance and bored expression as it walked closer to the bed, now directly in front of the blonde. Unable to release his frustration on the original, Naruto proclaimed, "You're a damn show-off who has no communication skills and is forever making my life painful, do you know that?" The clone just rolled his eyes, muttering an idiot under his breath as it helped Naruto into a standing position before leading him to the chest of drawers that held his clothes. He knew Sasuke would get the memory of this when the clone disappeared, but to Naruto that was too long away. Sasuke would no doubt be using this time to become even more ingrained in his, "I don't need people" attitude. It was enough to make Naruto seriously consider stomping down the stairs, finding Sasuke and, well, beating the shit out of him had never worked when he was a genin or during that time Sasuke was gone, but it sure as hell had made him feel better. He sighed loudly and rather overdramatically, making the clone glance at him briefly, but he didn't comment. Naruto was only mildly disappointed. He wanted to bitch at someone, and a Sasuke clone would have worked just fine. Then again, he was trying to be a good friend and prove that Sakura was wrong and that they could get along, so maybe not. And as much as Naruto hated to admit it, if he wanted to do both of those things, this would have to be one of the few circumstances in which he'd have to come up with a plan. It wasn't that he was bad at or even against them, he just preferred to do things on the spot. His life had always worked out better for him that way, so why mess with a good thing? Can you do the rest by yourself? Sasuke's clone asked, and Naruto blinked out of his thoughts. They had walked into the bathroom without him noticing, and the clone had already put his clothes beside the basin. Naruto nodded, and the clone removed his arm from Naruto's waist before walking out of the bathroom. "I'll be in the bedroom when you're done." The clone shut the door and Naruto was left to himself. Turning to look at the mirror, Naruto ran a hand through his hair, feeling both annoyed at Sasuke in general, and worried that he wouldn't be able to help him. "You had better appreciate everything I'm doing for you," he said softly. When nothing but silence greeted him, he just sighed before he started pulling off his clothes, his mind still focused on his best friend. He had better think of a damn good plan if he was going to get away with this. Break. By the time his shower had ended, Naruto felt only the tiniest sliver more secure in his theory about Sasuke. He had spent his time looking over all the information and the loose facts he had collected over the past week since waking up in the hospital. He was still stumped. All his brain could tell him solidly was that Sasuke was a confusing, indecisive who took pleasure in making Naruto frustrated. And apart from Sasuke's added unease in Naruto's company, he really hadn't changed much. Letting out a sigh, Naruto ran a hand through his still wet locks while staring at the mirror with a frown. His hand securely held his towel around his waist, making half of his seal visible. Usually he was self-conscious of it, but right now he barely noticed it. His mind was still too much of a jumbled mess. He knew that Sasuke was acting strangely. He knew it in his gut. Which was why it was annoying that all the physical proof seemed to point at him just being overly paranoid. His instinct would usually win out in a case like this, but he was trying to be a bit more guarded this time. He couldn't afford for his theory to be wrong when he didn't have his chakra to keep Sasuke from killing him. He also didn't want to end up back at the hospital. But maybe it would be the effort that counted. Granted, Sasuke had never given a damn about effort before, only about success. Yet how could you succeed if you didn't try? Exactly, you couldn't. So he'd just have to try. And Sasuke always had seemed more responsive to the stuff he came out with over everybody else. And since logic and strategy were never really his strong suit, walking in blindly and hoping for the best had the higher percentage of working, right? This is confusing. Naruto groaned and lightly rubbed his temples. He could feel a headache coming on. Sasuke, he has never stopped making my life difficult. Scowling at the mirror and imagining his friend's face instead of his own, he said angrily, "Do you hear me, Sasuke? You're an impossible." In hindsight, Naruto probably should have remembered that he was in Sasuke's house wearing a towel before he started raising his voice. "Stop calling me in." Sasuke cut himself off at the same time Naruto jumped, spinning around to find Sasuke frozen with one foot in the bathroom. Unfortunately, the abrupt movement was enough to dislodge his loosely tied towel, and with a rather high-pitched squeak, Naruto found himself scrambling for the material as it descended. Naruto would like to believe that he had caught it before he was bared to his friend, but he had a sinking feeling that it was more like when it reached his knees. Wrapping it tightly back around himself, he held it in a death grip as he shouted, mortified and with flushed cheeks, "I didn't say you could come in." Sasuke didn't move for a second, his eyes wide, jaw slightly dropped and a deep crimson blush on his cheeks, before he quickly turned on his heel and fled the scene. It was only as he was leaving that Naruto noticed the other Sasuke just behind him, and that when he was bumped into, by the Sasuke that had seen him, he vanished in a puff of smoke. Oh no, oh no. Oh God, please tell me that was not the real Sasuke. Please. Naruto ducked his head and squeezed his eyes shut. As much as he wanted to keep praying and denying it, he had definitely just been caught by his best friend. Fuck. Naruto groaned, straightening and running a hand over his face, which was still a little pink. As if I needed one more thing for him to freak out about. Just him. Not you. You're happy he saw you. Naruto grimaced before pulling on his clothes and responding out loud, "And no, that's not true. I mean, I just know it's not a big deal. Embarrassing, sure, but I mean, we're both guys and it's Sasuke. That means there's no reason to feel bothered when in front of him." He pretended not to notice that he was trying to convince his own inner voice, and therefore himself, of that fact, and concerned himself instead with hanging his towel on the towel rack, grabbing his dirty clothes and throwing them in the hamper. After tidying the room as much as he could, he quickly ran out of stalling tactics and had to reluctantly make his way towards the door. His legs were a little bit shaky from having been on them for so long, but there was no way in hell he was calling Sasuke into the bathroom to help him. The whole situation was too uncomfortable already. He didn't need them both coming back to the scene of the crime. Reaching the door, he let out a loud sigh. With his luck, this would make Sasuke even less responsive to his attempts at a conversation. But then again, he'd already lost most of his dignity already, so what else did he have to worry about? Well, there was that ever-looming, "What does Sasuke want out of me?" question. Because Sasuke would obviously have a fallback so his loneliness wouldn't be recognized. But, oh, it It couldn't be worse than some of the other things his friend had put him through over the years. And you're still stalling. Yes, yes, I know. Shut up. Naruto put a hand on the doorknob while shaking his head slightly and muttering under his breath, maybe I should get my head checked too. Hearing and responding to the sarcastic voice in your head has to be a sign of insanity. Sighing at the thought, he just smiled somewhat sardonically before opening the door, keeping a firm hold on the handle as he stepped into the room. The sight that greeted him, however, had him blinking before frowning quizzically, almost not sure if he wanted to laugh or ask Sasuke what he was doing. Sasuke was making his bed, and while the action itself wasn't one to usually inspire amused disbelief, the fact that Sasuke's movements were jerky as he did everything, including fluffing the pillows, proved how awkward he was truly feeling. He was scowling, too, but that was hardly anything new. Still, when Sasuke went back to the pillows, Naruto had to wonder, was it really called fluffing, when it looked like the pillows were about to explode? Do you really need to punch that pillow into oblivion? Naruto asked, a slight trace of humor seeping into his voice. Sasuke shot him a glare, and Naruto decided he could survive the brunt of Sasuke's anger if it meant that one of the most comfortable things he had ever slept on remained intact. But to Naruto's surprise, Sasuke didn't say anything. He just turned back to the pillow and shoved it against the headboard in disgust. Naruto almost sighed. He didn't really want to fight with Sasuke, he just wanted the awkward anger Sasuke had collected throughout the morning to disappear so they could have breakfast in peace. So, Sasuke, he began, trying his best to sound casual, now that you've finished beating my bed into submission, can we go eat? Once again, Sasuke didn't say anything in response. He just calmly walked over to Naruto and grabbed his left arm, putting it around his shoulders while wrapping his right arm around Naruto's waist. Naruto frowned before leaning forward so he could angle his face almost directly in front of the Uchihas. Sasuke's eyes narrowed, and if he didn't have to stay where he was to keep supporting him, Naruto had no doubts he would have flinched away at having his personal space violated. What? He snarled. Naruto continued to study him, pretending not to notice the venom in his voice. You're not a clone, are you? Sasuke's jaw clenched, and Naruto was almost tempted to poke his face, but he didn't want to push his luck. No. This time, Naruto couldn't resist the urge, and he flicked Sasuke's cheek, then talk to me. Sasuke's eye twitched. Do that again and I will throw you through a wall. AWH, you'd never do that to me, Sasuke, Naruto said in a teasing voice, pressing closer to Sasuke as he said it. He was confident that Sasuke wouldn't so much as pinch him when they were walking the way they were and with him still injured. I've done worse, Sasuke replied quietly. His face was blank, and he looked as if he wasn't even interested in the conversation. For a second, Naruto bought it, and he was about to make a quip about how no shit, that Chidori hurt like a bitch, bastard. But then the words suddenly caught up with him, and with it, the tone of Sasuke's voice. He felt like he'd been thrown through a loop before landing hard against the floor, because he'd been paying enough attention this time that Naruto was not only able but shocked to hear the guilt in Sasuke's voice. Sasuke had felt bad about it all this time. Why didn't he say anything? He couldn't honestly think that Naruto still held a grudge over it, could he? No, he had to have heard wrong. Naruto. Sasuke questioned sharply. But then why did he look so alarmed? Naruto blinked. He noticed then that Sasuke had stopped them in the foyer, and while he didn't think they'd walked far, the unease in Sasuke's posture and the way his eyes were darting all over Naruto's face suggested it had been long enough. Sasuke, Naruto began, but Sasuke cut him off. You zoned out. Are you having trouble focusing? His tone was businesslike, and he grabbed Naruto's wrist, seeming to check his pulse. Are you having a dizzy spell? Sasuke kept talking, but Naruto wasn't really listening. Was the guilt from thinking I was overworked? Or was it from the Chidori? Was it even guilt at all? Was I just reading too much into things? Naruto looked at Sasuke again. Only one way to find out. You know that I forgive you for everything that happened while you were gone, right? Sasuke froze, and when he looked at Naruto, his eyes had widened fractionally. Naruto still wasn't sure if it was what Sasuke needed to hear or not, but he figured he might as well finish what he'd started. They'd never spoken about it, after all. Maybe this was the time to do it. I mean it, Sasuke. I may use parts of it as ammunition in our arguments, but I've never actually held a grudge against you for it, even when you were starting those plans to destroy Konoha. You've proven that it's in your past now, and if I hadn't believed and trusted you, I wouldn't have stood by your side and fought to get the council to let you back in. Sasuke was still staring at him with an unreadable face when he finished. Now would probably be a good time to hug him, the little voice chirped up. Only, unlike all the other times, he could swear it sounded like Sakura. You need him to open up to you. Despite his misgivings about little voices in his head, this time it did seem to have a good idea, so turning his body slightly, he used the arm already on Sasuke's shoulders to pull him closer, moving his right arm to slip around Sasuke's back. Sasuke stiffened noticeably, and his voice had dropped to freezing point when he spoke. What are you doing? Hugging you. Now shut up and deal with it. He was honestly expecting to be shoved away and possibly yelled at. There was also the small part that thought Sasuke might stand there and grudgingly take it, but what he hadn't expected was to feel a small sigh brush his neck as Sasuke leaned into the embrace. It was only for a moment, but in those few seconds Naruto felt like his whole world had shifted. He smells nice, this is nice. Sasuke jolted him out of his thoughts by breaking away from him. Putting a hand to Naruto's chest, he gently pushed him away. You get weird when you've been in a hospital. It's called a hug, Sasuke. Naruto dryly said, falling easily back into familiar patterns. Learn to be a little more human, would you? Not everyone craves physical contact like you do, Naruto. You really should take that stick out of your. I read somewhere that hugs and shit can actually help extend your lifespan. 1. Sasuke shot him a look. You read something. Naruto rolled his eyes. Asshole. I'm trying to be serious here. You're right, I should pay attention. It's not like you're an idiot every day of the week. Naruto punched Sasuke, not even caring how weak he was. Bastard. Sasuke just smirked tauntingly, and although Naruto acted perturbed on the outside, he was internally grateful that things were back to normal. After all, there wasn't anything strange about two friends hugging or one ninja accidentally seeing the other in the bathroom. The second happened all the time on missions, he was sure, so the only reason it had felt weird at the time was because Sasuke was an antisocial recluse, and because they had been enemies and rivals for so long. That was all. And as for the hug, well, they just weren't used to being emotional around each other. It wasn't as if they liked it. Yeah, right. Naruto pointedly ignored that voice. Break. It didn't take them much longer to reach the kitchen. Oh, you know, just down one long hallway, past about 20 doors and then through a room Naruto assumed was the lounge room. But despite his slightly shaking legs, when Naruto had smelt and seen the food in the kitchen, his mouth had practically watered. Sasuke had made a rather large bowl of rice porridge. There was both toast and bread with various spreads beside them, and there was also a pile of about 10 pancakes which had red bean paste or maple syrup to choose from beside it. 2. Shrugging away from Sasuke, Naruto hurried, as fast as his sore legs would take him, over to the table and sat down in a chair, his eyes scanning the meal with glee. Tea, water or orange juice? Sasuke asked while setting a kettle and mugs on the table. Orange juice, Naruto replied absently while grabbing 2 pancakes, the red bean paste in one of the bowls Sasuke had put on the table for their porridge. Sasuke put the carton down beside Naruto before taking his own seat opposite the blonde. Naruto muttered his thanks as he finished collecting his food and put the porridge pot and bean paste back in the center of the table. Glancing at Sasuke, his blessing having been murmured, 3, and his knife and fork raised and ready to cut into his pancake, he saw that the Uchiha was watching him with faint amusement as he poured his tea. What? Naruto asked in confusion. Nothing, Sasuke answered simply before placing the kettle down and starting to get his own food. Naruto could feel his stomach rumbling, but he couldn't bring himself to eat yet. Not only was he now curious as to what had gotten Sasuke almost smiling, but he also felt rude eating before Sasuke started. He had been the one to cook everything, after all. Resisting the urge to tap his fingers while Sasuke slowly served up his food, couldn't the Uchiha see he was being polite and starving while he did it? Naruto settled for asking, "So, when are you going to train today?" Sasuke frowned at him. "I'm not training today." "Oh. You're taking the day off." Naruto nodded. "That's cool. You must have been having a lot of missions lately without me around." He grinned. "I am the best after all, so it only makes sense you'd be unable to handle my workload." "Idiot. Your missions are anything but hard." Sasuke's frown faded to something more serious. "I simply won't be training while you're here." Naruto blinked. "Wait. Come again. I'm looking after you," Sasuke stated simply. "I don't have the time to train." "Now just wait a minute." Naruto snapped, feeling his anger ignite like a match. "You're seriously going to sit there and tell me that for the indefinite future, you are going to slack on your training just because I'm here? I have to watch you," Sasuke told him coldly, his own agitation spiking at the presence of Naruto's. "That doesn't give me many other options, does it?" "Of course it does, you idiot." Naruto gestured at the house vaguely. "You've got a mansion with who knows how much backyard. Just go out there and train." Sasuke's eyes narrowed. "What part of, I have to watch you, don't you understand? Set me out there under a damn tree." Naruto rebutted. "I am not having you bitch and whine next week over how you can't throw a shuriken anymore." "You can't forget how to throw a shuriken in a week," Sasuke grumbled. Naruto rolled his eyes. "Whatever. Now how about you go train after breakfast, and I'll tell you how shit you are compared to me." He picked up the knife and fork he had put down during the argument and started cutting up some of his pancake. Twirling it on the fork, a shit-eating grin formed as he questioned, "That work for you? Or would you rather stay in here and be my housewife and nurse?" Picking up his own utensils, Sasuke stated, "I'm going to impale you with a kunai when we get out there." Naruto was unconcerned by the threat. Sasuke was all bark and no bite these days. Popping the piece of pancake in his mouth, Naruto's eyes closed without his permission as a small moan escaped. "So good." Cutting up an even bigger piece, he chewed it hungrily. "Shit, Sasuke, did you make this?" he asked. Sasuke looked decidedly uncomfortable when Naruto glanced at him, and while he doubted it was modesty at his cooking skills, Naruto honestly couldn't be bothered to figure it out right now. The food was too good, and he wasn't about to waste valuable eating time focusing on theories. "Yeah," Sasuke finally answered when Naruto had taken the time to try the rice pudding instead of gorging on the pancakes. He made another sound when the new flavor touched his tongue. It was more of a whimper this time, but he didn't care as he declared, "I'm never leaving. Ever. This is so good." Having another large spoonful, he eyed the table with calculating eyes. "How much of this could I get away with eating?" He moved his gaze to Sasuke, about to ask if he could eat the whole damn meal when he noticed that Sasuke was focused on his food, and his face had a weird but somehow familiar look to it. It took Naruto a few moments before he could place it. "Wistful. He looks wistful." Suddenly Sasuke was pushing his chair back. "I'm going to get ready." I'll be back in 10 minutes, and we'll head outside. Not waiting for a response, Sasuke grabbed a piece of toast before leaving the room abruptly. Craning his head to follow the other, Naruto stared after him in incredulity. Why do you always have to ruin a perfectly normal conversation by making it confusing as all hell? Naruto asked the empty room while turning back in his seat to face the table. Letting out a loud sigh, Naruto started eating his food with a lot less vigor than before. What made you so sad, Sasuke? He suddenly straightened and stared at the seat Sasuke had vacated with wide eyes. Is it because you don't want me to leave? Naruto ran a hand through his hair as a more pressing question came to mind. But if it is, why do you want me to stay? Better yet, the same voice that he was trying so hard to disregard asked loudly, how much do you want to stay? Naruto swallowed. Well, damn. How could he ignore that one?